pleasure to introduce to you Eva Fodor, who is a professor at the Department of Gender Studies at the Central European University that has just moved from Budapest to Vienna. She's also a co-director of the CEU Democracy Institute. Eva has shared with us the link in the chat about the institute, so you may have a look what they are doing now. Her research concerns mostly social inequalities, also in relation to gender and gender inequality in the labor market. She also takes on the comparative perspective in her works and looks at the role of institutional settings. And today, her talk will be very up to date because we'll hear something about the impact of the COVID pandemic on the division of care and gender inequality in Hungary, and not only, from what I understood. So thank you, Eva, once again that you agreed to join our seminar series. And now I give you the floor, so the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. It was a pleasure working with you while you were at the CEU, and it's nice to meet you all, even if only online. And I'm really excited to present this our findings, our recent findings about COVID, partially because it would be great to hear, this what I'm going to be talking about is Hungary. So it would be great to hear what your experience is, what your findings are from Poland or from elsewhere. So let me try and share my screen and go and start with the slides. So I will be talking about the impact of COVID-19 on gender inequality, and I'll try not to be very long about this. Yeah, this is really the research question. What is the impact of the pandemic on gender inequality? A lot of people have started to think about it, but there's not a lot of data out there. So much of what's been written is based on anecdotal evidence or sort of random kind of information. There are exceptions. There's a new UN survey. I don't know if you've seen it, and I'm happy to send you the slides. That's why I put the links in there. So the UN survey collects data from 50 or so countries and is trying to assess the impact of COVID on women's labor market and unpaid work, as well as, on gender and violence issues, all of these, and do a comparison. The Eurofund is also trying to do something, and there are some country studies as well, some based on survey data and some based more on thinking about the possibilities or thinking about the issues that we should be considering. There is a new issue of feminist economics coming out, and given that you're a group that's comprised of feminist economists, or at least to some extent, you might be interested on COVID specifically. So there's a lot written, there's a lot of thinking that started. But today I'm going to be talking about three things. First, I'm going to try and talk about the impact that we see of COVID on paid work and gender inequality in paid work in Hungary. And then I will connect this to our findings from a specific survey that we conducted in May 2020 on the division of care. And then finally, briefly discuss questions related to one specific form of employment, and that is home office work, which was, I think that's actually quite unique what happened with this in this respect in the world, and therefore it's worth examining what kind of impact that form of employment might have on gender inequality. Truthfully, this I actually probably have more questions than answers to the main issues here, but I hope that this will get a conversation started and hopefully raise issues in your heads as well and mine. Okay, so paid work. What do we know? This is from UN data. So I'll start globally and then go to Hungary. As I said, the UN has conducted a survey in a number of countries, and this is data from the 55 high and middle income countries for people over 25. And basically what they find is that in absolute numbers, if you look at the two bars or the four bars, the blue and the gray, the absolute number of job loss does not differ between men and women. about 29 million jobs were lost, both among men and women. But if you look proportionately, then given that women started at the lower level, this is a higher proportion of jobs. So you see some differences if you look at percentages between men and women. So arguably more women were more likely to lose jobs than men during the pandemic in these 55 countries. The UN report argues that this is the high-income countries. If you look elsewhere, you see an even starker differences between men and women. In Hungary, that's not quite the case. What you see is the number of employed people in thousands here. And this is primarily comparing the fourth quarter of 2019 and the fourth quarter of 2020. And what you see is that there's not a huge difference. So sort of, first of all, that there's not a lot of job loss overall within, in a year. There's certainly a dip in the second quarter. And also that there's not a huge, the gender inequality did not really grow very much. A little bit, yes, because women, in fact, were more likely to have lost their jobs, a bit more, but men also lost some. So there's some job loss among men as well. But really, these numbers are actually quite small. So slightly more job loss for women than for men. There's actually no change in the employment rate. At least among the most, the prime, sort of almost prime working age population, because the differences in the number of jobs is quite small. But something that you don't see here is interesting. There's one group that actually increased their labor force participation, their employment, and that is the group of 60 to 64-year-olds in both genders. And I think that probably has to do with sort of an emergency situation in which people who would normally start retiring between 60 and 64 decided not to retire and remain in the labor market, or perhaps re-enter the labor market to support other members of the family. This is true for both genders. So the story here is, I think, that there is more job loss among women, but certainly not, we can't talk about it like a huge change. But what is important, perhaps, or what's perhaps more important, is that more women than men cut back on work time. What you see here is in the top line is women working part-time. Not a lot of people work part-time in Hungary, like in Poland, but certainly more did, and especially in the second quarter, which returned to its previous level. But again, gender inequality here did not change a whole lot, but you can, but only a little. So it did change a little, but not a lot. Now, another question in terms of paid work, again, is, all right, so there's not a huge difference if you look at men and women overall, but maybe there's a difference if you look in terms of class differences or educational levels. And the question of whether or not the pandemic hit those at the bottom the most is often raised. And what you see here is the percentage difference in the number of employed men and women by educational level. And I compared the fourth quarter of 2019 and the fourth quarter of 2020. So the answer to the question, to the question of whether or not the pandemic hit those at the bottom most is yes. Those with tertiary level education, so that's at least a BA, at least a sort of a three-year BA or a 4-year college degree. I'm sure you also have sort of a mixture of college and university degrees, and we do too. So anybody beyond the high school did actually quite well, and there is in fact an increase in people in sort of the job, the employment rate of people with tertiary level education. But that's not true, of course, for lower in the educational hierarchy, with the exception of men in the secondary without skill category, and those are primarily construction workers, because you will see that construction actually has boomed during the pandemic, at least in Hungary. So what you see is that, but in general, what you see is that people without college degrees did worse than those with college degrees. And within these categories, at least in some, women did particularly worse than men. But again, so there's a difference, but the difference is not huge. I think the biggest story is not so much about those at the bottom, but those at the top, because what you see is a gender inequality amongst those with tertiary education. So you see that men with college degrees did extremely well during the pandemic. Women with tertiary degrees, you would expect them to have the same advantage, didn't. They were certainly advantaged compared to those with elementary level of education, but compared to similar men, they were not. I think that might be the biggest difference that we see here. Okay, so why is this happening? Previous crises, in fact, have favored women in the labor market. So during the crisis of 2008, women were less likely to have lost their jobs than men. And that was true for even the Great Depression in the United States. It was even arguably true for the transition, the state socialist, the communist capitalist transition in 1990, at least in some of the countries of the Central and East European region. And that was so because of the specific qualities of the labor market, specific changes in the labor market, and because of job segregation. So because for example, in the 2008 8-10 economic crisis, the kind of sectors that were impacted were those that were primarily dominated by men. So male-dominated sectors were more likely to shrink. Therefore, more men lost their jobs, and women were more likely to retain their jobs in the types of sort of service-oriented sectors in education and health that were less impacted by the crisis. So construction and manufacturing shrank. A lot of men worked there, therefore more men lost their jobs. And this was the pattern for a number of previous crises. So the question is this true for this present crisis? And so let me show you. These are male-dominated sectors of the Hungarian economy. I'm only talking about Hungary, and change in employment between the fourth quarter of 2019 and 2020. So if this was like the crisis of 2008, then what we would see is numbers under 100. So what you would see is a huge job loss in these sectors, and that's not really the case. The story is pretty mixed. There's a lot of job loss in mining and mineral manufacturing, which actually is a very small sector, but there's quite, there's growth, in fact, in communication informatics, and there's a growth in machine production, metal manufacturing, and construction. The darker colors are the two sectors where a lot of men work. So these are the sectors where at least 2/3 of the workers are men, but the largest of these are construction and transport. And I mean, you see this, you see that construction is booming. The transport sector has shrunk. So you can't quite argue that you wouldn't quite expect that men would be losing more jobs because their male-dominated sectors are closing or shrinking faster. And the same is true for female-dominated sectors. It's not true that female-dominated sectors are all growing strong. These are the female-dominated sectors of the Hungarian industry, so the sectors where at least 2/3 of the workers are women. And what you see is that textile has shrunk, small trade, which is again one of the large ones. The darker colors here are also the ones where a lot of women work. But education and health remain roughly the same, and finance has grown. So in some sense, if anything, female-dominated sectors did worse than male-dominated ones, but it's difficult to tell. There's not a clear pattern, unlike in previous crises. So it seems that these kinds of structural change in the labor market do not predict or do not explain the differential job loss between men and women. So maybe women suffer some disadvantage within otherwise gender-neutral, gender-balanced sectors. These are the sectors where between 45 and 55% of the employees are women. And again, the darker ones, sort of weird color, brownish color, and dark green color are the ones which are the larger. And you see, well, one kind of story in one and another kind of story in the other. There's no coherent pattern here. In some sectors, women are doing better than men. So for example, in pharmaceutical production, more women were employed. Obviously, that's an area that's growing. That's a sector that's growing right now, but more women were employed. Women increased their employment more than men. Similarly in real estate, but at the same time in trade, for example, which is important, women within the sector, women were disadvantaged. So I think the story is that there is no coherent story that has to do with changes in that has to do with shrinking or sort of shrinking or improving or increasing sectors. So sectoral change does not really explain what's happening with men's and women's job, at least not on this macro level. So to summarize, so far I've talked about paid work on the basis of macro level data. Eventually we would need better data, and we would need to link these data to, of course, individual outcomes, but I don't have access to that kind of stuff yet, because data access in Hungary is not as easy as one might expect. But overall, what you see is that women were a bit more disadvantaged than men. The less educated were hit harder than the better educated, and that the story is not quite explained by sectoral change, which is typically what used to be the most important predictor of job loss and gender inequality in previous crises. Okay, so that was part one. So what could explain gender inequality in Hungary and elsewhere? Well, the division of care work. This could be one possible explanation. Indeed, other data or people also working in this field have found that and I have not actually seen the data, but I've seen the report that that was published, which showed that women with care response with small children were more likely to have lost their jobs than women who did not have children. And specifically women with school-age children were more likely to have lost their jobs. Not tiny babies or not older children, but specifically school-age children, which indicates care that the cause could be care responsibilities. So certainly care is important, and it's closely linked to labor market participation. But of course, care, and we know about the motherhood penalty, and we know that it varies quite a bit, but it's strong in a lot of countries, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, as we know from this very distinguished article that I just read recently. And that in and of itself, of course, is a form of gender inequality. So whether or not inequalities in care work are tied to paid labor market participation, that's important. But even if they're not, inequalities in care work is something to be considered when we talk about work and gender. So the question is, what is the impact of the pandemic on care work? What I'm going to talk about now is our survey, and the survey was taken in Hungary. The political context is important in Hungary because to some extent similar to Poland, but not completely. But the Hungarian government has provided very little support to parents, and especially to mothers, to provide care work. We have a lot of pronatalist policies, but all of them are funding families to buy stuff, to build houses, to buy cars. But if you go to a workplace, work-life balance policies are difficult to find. In fact, part-time work, flex-time work are very difficult to access in Hungary. So, and of course, the political context is such that the notion that men should be doing care work is somehow not on the political agenda, and the political discourse always associates care with women, and in fact identifies femininity with caring as well. I actually, in another research project, have found that the motherhood penalty in Hungary, expressed in wages, has increased between 2010 and 2017, I argue, as a result of the actions of the government. So the political context is such that it does not really encourage men to be participating in care work. So you would expect to see a large, you would expect to see gender inequality in care work during the pandemic, and possibly it to grow. So we have, what I'm going to be talking about is based on this paper from here on, at least. And I need to mention my co-authors, Aniko Gregor, Julia Koltai, and Esther Kovács, and our affiliation list is probably longer than the paper itself. But we're all affiliated with all of these things. And you're welcome to read the paper. It's actually a very simple paper, and I'll give you the gist now. So the paper explored care work and gender division of care work during the pandemic, and try to figure out what the factors were that that explain the gender division. We conducted a survey, which is representative of Hungarians between 18 and 65 years old. We have 1,900 respondents. It was conducted during the last week of the lockdown, or the last but one at the end of May. So by then, which was great, because by then people had experience with, and an understanding of their life during the lockdown, which is what we asked them about. In this analysis that I'm going to be presenting, I'm only including 628 people, those who are parents of children under 18 and who live with them. And this is actually a very simple paper with a series of linear regressions. Okay, I'll tell you more, but let me explain the variable, the response variable, which is childcare, and in fact, change in childcare. So we asked the question of, before the coronavirus epidemic, how many hours a week did you spend in total on parenting activities such as playing, storytelling, learning, talking, dressing, feeding your children? We asked that question, and then we asked the same question during the during the restrictive measures introduced as a result of the pandemic. How much time in total did you spend on this and that? So we got two numbers, and we calculated a simple difference. Now, we all know that these numbers are notoriously biased. So when you ask people how much time they spent on this or that, they'll tell you all sorts of answers. But we thought that we would, in fact, we had an earlier survey in which we asked a slightly different question. We asked the same thing slightly differently. We asked whether or not they're spending more time or less time, and how much, and a lot more or a little more. And what we found was not altogether different. So we decided to handle these numbers as sort of a subject, not as a concrete sort of fact, but as a subjective indicator of time use. We don't need to sort of fetishize the numbers that people told us, but certainly when people gave us a really large number, what they wanted to express was, we are spending a whole lot more time than before, right? So that's that. In that sense, we are quite convinced, and also because the results are in line with our previous findings, where the same thing was measured slightly differently, we're quite convinced that these numbers are giving us sort of reasonable results and reasonable information. So our main explanatory variable was gender. We were trying to explain this difference, the increase in time spent on childcare. By gender, but we also have a bunch of control variables, including age and education, and whether the person lives in a city or not, employment status, obviously, whether the person is working for wages or not, the kind of job that they're working in, whether or not they're working in a home office, and also we tried to see if gender role attitudes had an impact, and I can tell you now that they don't. So what are our findings? I'll quickly give you the findings here, and then I'll explain them one by one. So basically the findings is that on the one hand, both men and women increase the time that they put into childcare, both. That's a good thing, men too. And women added a lot more hours than men, a whole lot more hours than men. Now the gender gap was the highest among the highly educated couples. Maybe this is what we see reflected in the numbers in the paid labor market, and that home office work had some impact, but did not really explain either number 3 or certainly not number 2, point number 3 or point number 3. So 3 or 2. And let me go. So I'll now spend a little bit more time explaining each one of these. So both men and women increased the time that they put into childcare. The green sort of bars are men, and you see that men increased their hours per week on average from 19.2 to 26.1, and women from 32.3 to 43.8. This is the number of hours per week dedicated to childcare. So it's the same proportion. So both men and women added 35% more, but given that women started at a different place, the actual number of hours that they added is a whole lot more than men. So the difference is certainly larger. And the fact that women dedicated more time to childcare than men was true even after we controlled for a variety of those independent variables that I just showed you. Let me show you our model, which is very simple. This is the actual, the dependent variable is the difference in hours, change in hours dedicated to childcare. And in the first model, you just see gender. And basically what you see is that gender remains significant no matter what we add into the equation. But the other things, the other variables are also potentially interesting. So if you look at model 2, you see gender. So women are spending a lot more time on childcare net of these other factors. But you see that college graduates are also spending a whole lot more time. Those who live in a big city spend significantly more time increase their time on childcare. And of course, obviously, those who have smaller children and those who live with another person, because then they're likely to have children, also dedicate more time to childcare. So model 2 is for everybody. Those are some of the factors that explain the size or the volume of time dedicated to childcare. In model 3, we added, model 3 is only among people who are working. And there we were particularly interested in the impact of working in a home office. And you see, predictably, to some extent, that working in a home office increased or explains some of the change in the number of hours that people dedicate to childcare. So this is the story, but let me now highlight what we think is interesting of this story. And this is the third point. So we also, to these models, we also introduced interaction effects. And one interesting thing we found was that amongst the college gender inequality was the largest, or has grown the most among the college educated population, urban college educated, I should say. This, what you see is the predicted, using the models, the predicted change in the number of hours that's dedicated to childcare. So among those without college degrees, you see that men increase their hours from 6.38 to 7.43. So they increased it a bit. But among college graduates, you see, men increase, yeah, you see that, among those without the college degree, yeah, men increase their hours 6.38 and women 7.43. So a little bit, there's some gender inequality, but not a lot. Among college graduates, a huge gender inequality. Men spend 9.1 hours more and women 18.8 hours more. So huge, there's a huge difference here. In fact, if you create more profiles and look at those with the variables rural, where the person lives and how much education they have and gender, what you see is that, people kind of increase the number of hours that they spend on childcare, kind of almost the same, around 8 to 10 hours, except for one group. And these are urban college educated women who increased this time by 23.5 hours per week on average. So that is the group that stands out. What could explain this? Lots of things. Here are three suggestions. And again, these are hypotheses. This is the group that's most likely to be working from home, so have more time to care. And we will explore this when I talk about home office work. But this is also the group that's most likely to have lost the support of grandparents. So urban people who live in urban areas used a lot of grandparental help, but given the pandemic and the restrictions on the movement of elderly people, those grandmothers and grandfathers were not able to pitch in. That work it seems, was picked up by women. And finally, we are fairly convinced, and some qualitative studies also show, that educated urban women were the most likely to subscribe to the concept of intensive mothering or helicopter mothering. And were most suffered from status anxiety to the point where they were worried that if they don't provide a lot of support to their children, then those children might be left behind, might not be able to do well in the future. So this is the group that feels possibly the sort of the intensifying competition on the labor market, and are most worried about their children being successful and getting good jobs, and they know that in order to do that, they need to compare. They cannot be left behind, and this is the group that sort of where it seems that women seem to have sort of internalized the notion that it is their responsibility to make sure that their children do not suffer this fate. So we think that, and in fact, some qualitative studies where people actually talk to women looking after children, we heard this. These were my colleagues doing this. We heard anxieties like that expressed primarily by educated women living in larger cities. So in any case, the story is that gender inequality in care work during the pandemic was sizable, but especially large among the highest educated. Now, okay, so so that brought us to home office work, because we thought, well, maybe, like I said, one of the reasons why women were doing all this extra work was because they were more likely than men to be working in a home office, which is in fact the case. So how can we get men to do more care work? We know one thing that doesn't really work, and we know another that does. Labor market position does not really do the trick. So it is well known that that just because in a couple a woman makes more money doesn't mean that she's going to be doing less domestic work or childcare work. In fact, people argue that oftentimes women have to compensate for men's loss of masculinity when women make more money. So women have to do gender in a specific way, and in fact do more care work, more household work, even if they're in a more advantageous labor market position, even if they bring in more money to the family's budget. So that doesn't seem to work. Having higher wages doesn't seem to persuade partners to pitch in more at home. Social policies do seem to work. At least research that I've read so far have found that in countries where paternity leave is long, and when fathers actually do spend lengthier periods of time with small children, then they're likely to do so later on as well. So when fathers get involved early, then they keep up that involvement, and therefore social policies can in fact prompt men to do more care work. But here we have a natural experiment happening, and that is home office work. So we can test the impact of a third factor, which is proximity, being there, witnessing the burden of childcare work, physically being in the home office. So the question is, if both men and women worked in the home office, would men be doing more care work? Would that reduce gender inequality in care when men are physically present, and when they're not doing care work because they're out in the working far away from home, and women are at home, but everybody's there, so everybody has a chance to really do the work. So what's happening with home office work? The Hungarian labor market is extremely inflexible from the point of view of the employee. It's as I said, work-life measures are negligible, and flexible work arrangements also. But during the pandemic, a lot of people started to work from home. In a national, at least in the Hungarian Statistical Office's accounts, in the peak month, 18% of employees between 15 to 74 worked in a home office. In our survey, this percentage was closer to 30%. That's partially because we were dealing with the 25 to 65-year-old age range. I think that's why that was the reason. I don't think it was, I hope it was not biased, or we actually made sure that it was not biased. So, a sizable portion of the population and a larger, women were more likely to be working from a home office than men, about 20% more. Now, let's look at the changes in work hours dedicated to childcare during the lockdown. So again, this is just a change. by the location of work. Is it true that if people work in a home office, then gender inequality disappears? Well, the answer is no. I think that's pretty obvious from the graph. What you see is that women working from their workplaces spend 4.6 hours more on childcare. If they work in a home office, then they spend 16.5 hours more. Men, if they work in a workplace, they spend about 3 hours more. If they work in a home office, they spend more on childcare, but only 10 hours more. So you see the difference between the 16 hours that women dedicate to childcare and the 10 hours that men dedicate to childcare, both of whom, once we control for home office. And in fact, this is when we introduce an interaction effect into the equation, you can see this, controlled for, and even after we controlled for everything that we could potentially think of. Okay, or I'm being a little loose here, but after we controlled for education and age and all these other factors, what you see is that if you're amongst people who do not work in a home office, men spend, these are the predicted change. This is a predicted change based on the model. So men spend 3 hours more and women about 9 hours more if they don't work in a home office. And in a home office environment, men spend about 4.5 hours more and women 16 hours more. So working in a home office does not eliminate the gender inequality in care work. In fact, the findings from this article by Del Boca and a bunch of other people from Italy showed very much the same. So it seems that proximity, the physical presence, did not prompt men to be doing more childcare work. As I said, qualitative studies indicate a similar change. And here's a lovely story, lovely quote from a teacher, a mother of 2 children. And she says, now dad makes breakfast, not mom. She's talking about herself because mom has her class. So there are some small changes, but he does not overdo it. Maybe once or twice a week he makes breakfast. But when I clean up, he takes the kids out to the yard and plays with them. And this is great. So you see that men are pitching in a little, but certainly not systematically and nowhere near on the scale that women were doing. Oops, hold on. Now, what kind of work, hold on, let me just make sure that yes. What kind of work are women doing? What we found was that most of the difference came down to a different degree of help that women put into children's education. This is also why we felt that this notion of intensive mothering and the status anxiety that women and the worry about the children's future, which women seem to internalize more as their responsibility, is what contributes to this gender difference. So women work a whole lot more with children and children's schooling. 35% of women, but only 23% of men participated in the classes with children. Some of you might have small children. That they needed help being in school. 61% of women, but less than half of men help with uploading tasks and with those daily issues that are related to schoolwork. There was a huge difference. About 80% of women and roughly 60% of men help with keeping deadlines, doing homework, keeping in touch with teachers. This graph at the bottom is interesting because what you see is this is one of these items, help with doing homework. What percent of, this is a different question. So what percent of men say that they help children with homework? Among those men who work in a home office, 53% said that they did. Among those who work in a workplace, 68% did. So in fact, a home office didn't seem to be prompting men to be more active in supporting children in their schoolwork. Amongst women, you see no difference. Women help with homework no matter what. So a lot of the reason, or sort of a lot of the reason for the gender difference has to do with a differential participation of men and women in helping children with school. So home office work, there's a dilemma here. So women did a great deal more of childcare, even amongst those who work in a home office. so home office, working in a home office was a very different experience. It was a gendered experience. It was a different experience for men and women. In our survey, a lot more women than men said that they, and I quote, these are from the survey, had to look after kids and work simultaneously, that they couldn't live up to workplace expectations. We asked people whether or not they agree or disagree with these claims, and a lot more women said that, complained about this. Anecdotal evidence or evidence for qualitative studies also suggests that home office was a major source of anxiety. So if you just look at the papers, that's what those are popping out at you. That was a major source of anxiety for particularly parents or mothers of young children. Yet, so it was very clear that home office and proximity doesn't help ease gender inequality in paid or in unpaid work. Yet, when we asked people what would help them, what they think would help ease the gender equality dilemma, ease their work-life balance problems, home office was the most popular choice. So even after women had the experience of struggling with working in a home office, even after they experienced the fact that their spouses are not going to help a whole lot more, even if they're at home, this was still sort of the best that they could think of. So we felt that this notion of home office and the possibility of working in a home office raises further questions. A lot of people are talking about how this might be, in the future, maybe there's going to be more opportunities for working from home, or there's going to be more flexibilizing work options now that we have some experience with this. So this raises at least three new research questions, and I want to end with this. The first is whether or not, these are findings are about Hungary, but do we expect to find the same in less conservative regimes? Hungarians are notoriously conservative when it comes to gender role attitudes, for example. Would we expect the same kind of sort of lazy participation from men in countries where there's more support, more state government support for men's care work? One would hope so, or one would think so. So in that means policies could in fact have an impact on the division of care work. Right. The second question is sort of the varieties of home office issue, something that should be studied. Because of course, the kind of home office experience that women had in March and April is different from the one that they have now. Now schools, or at least primary schools and kindergartens, at least in Hungary, are open. In March, they were not. So it's important, but of course, there are still a lot of restrictions. And then you can imagine a situation where there are no restrictions. So for example, it's much freer to have grandparents involved. So it would be important to explore what are the conditions where a home office environment is in fact supportive, and whether or not in different kinds of home office situations, gender inequality is the same. And finally, something that I am going to be working on, or I hope I will be working on next if I ever finish my previous project, also has to do with home office, but less about has to do less with gender. I'm interested in how home office work is regulated. That actually, in fact, could be gendered. There's a lot of discussion about how labor control changes now with all sorts of digital technologies being part of our everyday experience, how labor control changes from sort of a factory type of environment to different types of environment. Home office is a kind of environment that has not been studied from this point of view. And so I think it would be interesting to see how employers actually make people work, and whether or not this is as gendered as other forms of labor control are. So this is the end of the story, but I want to leave you with a ray of optimism here. And therefore, I'm going to show you one last graph, and that is about elder care. Because in addition to childcare, we also looked at other forms of care work, and elder care was one. And basically what we saw is that even though in terms of childcare, gender inequality increased during the pandemic, but in terms of elder care, it decreased. Both men and women decreased the number of hours that they spent helping elderly relatives, but women increased it a whole lot more, and men increased it a lot less. again, granted, women started from a different point, had been spending a whole lot more time. But in this regard, at least in terms of elder care, men pitched sort of gender inequality decreased. This has to do with the fact that the kind of work that there was a lot of need for men to do the shopping or do the repairs, and that is primarily what they were doing. But nevertheless, this is one form of care where gender inequality decreased during the pandemic. And I'll stop here. Thank you.